There's an entire generation of people who grew up watching Saturday morning cartoons on a boxy television set and then somehow ended up doom scrolling through TikTok at 2 in the morning. And researchers genuinely aren't sure how to categorize them. If you were born somewhere between 1977 and 1985, you're technically on the edge of Generation X, but calling you a millennial would make most people in that group visibly uncomfortable. You're what some sociologists began referring to as a cusper around the early 2000s. Others prefer the term Xennial, spelled with an X. And the reason people keep trying to name this group is because what happened during those particular years shaped something genuinely distinct from anything on either side. So today, we're going to look at what actually makes this group psychologically interesting. Your childhood was quiet in a way that's hard to explain to anyone younger. Boredom wasn't a problem to be solved with a device. It was just Tuesday. You played outside until it got dark. You memorized your best friend's home phone number. And if a plan fell through, there was no way to know until you were already standing at the door, wondering where everyone went. The timing of everything that followed that childhood had real consequences. Most people alive today either grew up fully analog or fully digital. There's no real in-between for them. But you hit your late teenage years and early 20s right when the internet went from something you read about in magazines to something your parents were suddenly asking you to help them set up. Think about how strange that transition actually was when you slow it down. One year, you're passing handwritten notes in class and making mix CDs for people you had a crush on. The next, you're creating profiles on websites with terrible layouts and messaging strangers in chat rooms that would horrify you now. And somehow, both of those things feel like the same lifetime. That's because they were. And the brain doesn't treat those two experiences the same way. Research on neurological development has consistently shown that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for adaptation, learning, and integrating new information, continues developing well into a person's mid-20s. A paper in Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience confirmed that this region is particularly receptive to complex, novel experiences during late adolescence and early adulthood, which means that you absorbed the shift to digital technology during exactly the window when your brain was most capable of building lasting, flexible frameworks around it. Not just learning it, but actually integrating it. This produced something that looks a lot like cognitive bilingualism. You can read a paper map. You also have no problem updating software or troubleshooting a wireless network. You remember the physical weight of a printed phone directory. You also send documents across the world in seconds without thinking twice about it. Those two things coexist in you in a way that doesn't really exist elsewhere. And it shows up in subtle ways that you might not have ever named out loud. Your relationship with attention is different, for instance. You spend enough years without a constant stream of incoming notifications that you actually know what it feels like to be mentally still. That's not nothing. A lot of people younger than you have never experienced that, and they don't know what they're missing. You also have a different relationship with your own personal history. Nothing from your teenage years was ever uploaded anywhere. The stupid things you said, the phases you went through, the friendships that ended badly, none of that exists in a searchable database. It lives only in the imperfect, softening memory of the people who were there. Psychologists who study autobiographical memory have long documented that human recall is inherently reconstructive. We don't retrieve memories the way you'd open a file. We rebuild them, and in doing so, we edit them. That process is actually important for psychological health. It allows us to grow past things, to reframe experiences, to let certain versions of ourselves quietly retire without being confronted by time-stamped evidence. But here is where your generation's story gets harder. Right as you were supposed to be building something, careers, savings, some version of stability, the financial system collapsed. The 2008 crisis hit the Xennial demographic during what researchers call the establishment phase of adult development, the window roughly between 25 and 35 when people are making foundational decisions about work and money. Studies on economic disruption consistently show that instability during this particular life stage leaves marks that outlast the instability itself. People who lose jobs or financial security during their late 20s and early 30s often carry a background level of financial anxiety for decades afterward, even when their circumstances improve significantly. The threat model doesn't fully update, so what you're working with is a combination that nobody really discusses. Technological adaptability on one side and economic wariness on the other. You are genuinely comfortable with change. You've proven that. But somewhere in the background, there is often a quiet awareness that things can fall apart without warning, and that no amount of preparation makes you completely safe. The broader cultural conversation around generations tends to flatten all of this. The shorthand of boomer versus millennial versus Gen Z doesn't leave much room for the nuance of people who genuinely existed in two different worlds simultaneously. The categories are useful for selling things and writing headlines. They're less useful for actually understanding what people experienced. What Xennials navigated is a specific kind of paradox. You were raised with enough independence that you developed real self-reliance. Your parents weren't tracking your location. You solved problems without a step-by-step tutorial. You got bored and found your way out of it on your own. That kind of upbringing builds something in a person that's genuinely hard to replicate through instruction. And yet, you arrived in adulthood during the era of early social idealism about technology, the period before people understood the trade-offs clearly. You were early adopters by circumstance, which meant you were also the first people to feel the gap between what the internet promised and what it actually delivered. That gap became part of how you understood the world. What seems to define people in this group more than anything is a comfort with contradiction. You hold both things at once without needing to resolve them. Old enough to remember, young enough to adapt. Skeptical without being cynical. Connected without being dependent. That particular combination of traits is rarer than it sounds. You remember what existed before the current moment, and you also genuinely appreciate what replaced it. That's a harder position to hold than either pure nostalgia or pure enthusiasm. It requires you to keep two stories in your head at the same time and resist the urge to let one of them win. You gave up something real, the ability to be unreachable, the version of presence that exists when there's truly nothing else competing for your attention. The patience that grows in you when waiting is just part of life and not a failure of the system. Those things mattered, and they shaped people in ways we're only beginning to study seriously. But you also gained things your earlier self couldn't have conceived of, and you were conscious enough of the transition to actually notice the difference. That awareness is the thing, not the technology itself, and not the analog past either, but the ability to stand at the boundary and see clearly in both directions. If any of this lands, it's probably because you've spent years feeling like you don't quite belong in either of the generations people try to assign you to. That's not a mistake in the categorization. That is the categorization. The defining feature of your experience is the seam itself. In a period of history that keeps demanding adaptation, having lived through one complete transformation of the world and having come out capable of functioning well on both sides of it, is a kind of preparation that's genuinely hard to manufacture. You didn't just witness the shift. You were reshaped by it during exactly the right years for that reshaping to stick. That's the Xennial experience. And it's worth understanding Not because it makes you exceptional in any self-congratulatory sense, but because the thing you lived through is still being lived by everyone, just without the same reference point. You know what before felt like. That context is more valuable than it might seem. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps. And if you want to support more content like this, there's a membership option linked below. I have more videos in the works that follow the same thread. Different angles, same level of depth. I'll see you there.